was the first thing that they thought of. And that's how important it is. In fact, Thomas Jefferson famously said that if he had to choose between a government without a free press and a free press without a government, he would choose to have a free press without a government. And he was slightly exaggerating, but his point was about the importance of the press. The First Amendment says that the government of the United States should make no law that hurts the ability of the press to function. That same amendment also guarantees the right to protest and the right of religious organizations not to be interfered with by the government. And what that means for the press is basically that the government has to basically let the press write about whatever it wants. And that includes classified information. Unlike some countries, the United States doesn't have an official secrets act that makes it against the law for newspapers to publish classified information. It's still against the law for government employees to give newspapers classified information, but not for the newspapers to publish it. And another thing that happens in the United States that's a good thing for the press is our libel laws. And that means that a government official, for example, or even a private citizen can't sue a newspaper saying you soiled my reputation. What they would have to prove is that the newspaper knew in advance and maliciously tried to hurt somebody's reputation, as opposed to just publish something that maybe didn't make the person look good. So the bottom line is, in the United States, our most fundamental law, the Constitution, and all the laws that follow from it, and all the court decisions protect news organizations from their fundamental role of keeping the spotlight on and presenting facts about not just government, but also private companies and the society at large. So I can talk a little bit about why the press is important. I think it's really key to talk about that. So, because a lot of people say, well, why do we need reporters? Why do we need a free press or a press at all? The reason is basically that the press is unlike the government or corporations, for example, at least at its best. The press is not biased. They do not have an interest in making you believe something so that they can, say, make more money or stay in power. The press is interested in the truth. I say at its best, because we are not perfect. We are human beings. We make mistakes. Sometimes, and too often in the United States, the press is allied with one political party or another. But we have news organizations in the United States, major newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and I would put CNN in this category also, that do their best to present information in as unbiased a way as possible, as close to the truth as they can humanly get. So why does this matter? This matters because everyone in a society needs to have correct information in order to make decisions about how to do everything from whether to repair a bridge to whether to vote against a politician in the case of a democracy. I would argue that even if it's not a democracy, a free press is vital, but of course you're less likely to have one in a country that's not a democracy. But especially in a democracy, people need to be able to govern themselves. They need to be able to know whether they should vote for one person or another. They need to be informed about what's happening. And a free press is the best way to make sure that they are informed so that the society can be efficient, effective, and fair. And or as much as possible. And oh, by the way, we also entertain people. We write things and we show things on television that enrich people's lives. So there's that aspect also.
John, can I ask, you said that, press need to be there to inform people to the best of their ability, truthfully, what is going on. Can't people just find what's going on YouTube, on Facebook, from their neighbors? talking to a government official, perhaps if you talk to a government official in your daily life. Can't people find this information elsewhere? Why do they need reporters, journalists, specifically for this?
First, the government official or the person who works for a particular company might have a bias. They might have it in their interest to tell you something that's not quite exactly true, okay? Secondly, almost everything that you and I see on the internet comes from a reporter like me, comes from a reporter like me talking to a citizen or talking to a government official and reporting on the information that I gather. And that is what ends up on the internet. That's what people, even people who express opinions, are expressing opinions about information that usually comes from reporters. Now, increasingly nowadays, information on the web comes from what we call citizen journalists. Pretty much anybody with an iPhone can record what's happening in the street and post it online. So yeah, you can get information that way. But reporters, unlike your ordinary citizens, have time, and they are paid to spend time to get it right and to get as much information as possible and get it from all sides. Okay. So in other words, the ordinary person does not have time to do this. And so we have the time and we have the motivation to tell the truth.
And also, like you said, you have the time and you know where to look for things.
True.
I think with your journalism, with the reporting you do, you're often looking through public records. So perhaps you could explain to our audience. I know that sounds like a boring question, guys. Don't tune out just because I asked about public records. It's kind of interesting, actually. If you could talk a little bit about these records that exist in the United States that reporters and anyone have access to, and how those help you really craft prize-winning stories.
Well, I mean, thank goodness we do have so many different organizations. We have audit organizations, for example, here in Washington that write about government programs and we'll say, for example, or whether they come to the conclusion or not, they'll maybe present information that will lead you to conclude that a program is wasting the taxpayers' money, for example. And so what that is one of the things I do is look around and look at some of these documents and try to find out, well, how much did they say that ship was going to cost, for example, versus how much it did cost and why, and get experts to weigh in. And you're allowed to do all this in the United States. And so a lot of times the members of Congress, they don't necessarily know about or act on things until the press kind of forces them to act on it, until they can't avoid taking action on it, because now the public knows that this one ship cost $1 billion, for example, just making that up. Usually it's more than $1 billion. So that's why, using our expertise and using our time, we are able to put information in front of the public that forces people in power to do something about things. Not always, but a lot of times. And certainly more often than if we weren't around to present the information.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's why we have a phrase in English that reporters, journalists, the press are the watchdogs for government, because they're watching what the government is doing and holding them accountable.
Right.
So, John, you've covered major stories, sometimes very sensitive stories, about deadly military accidents, Navy warships that cost $8 billion each, but were never built. So I imagine that not everyone is happy with all of your stories that you write. I'm wondering if there was ever a time where you had your First Amendment rights violated in your own reporting, and if you could share that with us.
Well, thank God I never have felt that as a result of something that I wrote or something I was going to write, that I was threatened in any way. And I wish every reporter around the world could say that, but unfortunately they can't, because plenty of reporters are threatened, are hurt, are put in jail, or even killed because of what they write. So I am in a privileged position in the United States because I don't have to worry about that. I mean, there was one thing that happened to me, but the response to it illustrates how important the role of the press and an open society is. And that was a couple of years ago, I was at a government agency trying to ask an official from that agency a question in a hallway, which we're allowed to do. And the security guards backed me up against the wall, knocked me against the wall, and forced me to leave the building. And so this was an example of the press being mistreated, but I kind of made them famous. I managed to make public the fact that they had done this. And it was in pretty much every major newspaper in the United States that they had done this. And senators wrote to the head of the agency asking, demanding answers about what happened. So, that's an example of, I think, a security officer who just kind of got out of control, not a systemic problem, but the response to it was encouraging because it showed that people say in the United States, there are certain things you don't do. And one of the things you don't do is you don't hurt a reporter who is just trying to tell the public what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Thank you for that. So I mentioned that you chair the Press Freedom Committee for the National Press Club. And for those of you who don't know, the National Press Club is a huge worldwide, I guess, reporters organization. So you chair the Press Freedom Committee for them. Can you tell me, what does the Press Freedom Committee do?
Well, the National Press Club is comprised of reporters and also people who do public affairs, communications work. And so it has several thousand members, mostly in the United States. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we're kind of one of the oldest, established in 1908, one of the oldest organizations that represents the press. And so when we issue a statement about an issue or a concern, it has resonance. In fact, we have more resonance probably around the world than we do in the United States. And what we do is we issue statements and speak out when we feel that the press is being harmed, whether it's in the United States or somewhere else around the world. For example, we issued a statement a few days ago when Israeli warplanes bombed a building in Gaza that housed some, that the Israeli military said housed some Hamas intelligence offices, but that also happened to house families and the offices of the Associated Press, Algiers, and other news organizations. They were given an hour of warning, thank goodness, to get out, which was not very much, but no life was lost. It turned out that was the third time in a week that the Israelis had bombed the building that had press offices in it. So to us, it raised the question. First of all, we could not stay silent when any country is blowing up a building with our news professionals in it. But it also raised the question of whether the Israelis might be trying to reduce the coverage of the situation in Gaza by attacking multiple press organizations, including arguably the leading ones like AP and Al Jazeera. And so we issued a statement, and we believe that we agree with the president of AP that there should be some kind of investigation of this, that it shouldn't just be a matter of the Israelis saying, well, Hamas was in there, and so and we gave everyone warning, so don't worry about it. Well, we'd like to see some more independent investigation of what happened. So that's the kind of statement that we do. And we've done a number of other statements that pertain to governments, including in the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you for that. I know your organization also monitors journalists who are imprisoned, American journalists. Well, I'm not sure if it's just American journalists. Maybe you can correct me on that. Journalists who are imprisoned abroad.
Anywhere.
Can you talk about maybe anywhere? So they're not just American journalists.
Right.
So any journalist imprisoned,
right.
and you guys will advocate on behalf for their release. Could you tell me maybe about some cases that you're working on now about journalists who are imprisoned in other
Sure,
countries?
sure. Well, we did a case yesterday about a woman in Bangladesh named Rosi Islam, who was detained and faces, I believe, 14 years in jail, basically because she wrote some news articles about government corruption that the government in Bangladesh didn't like. That was the most recent instance. We have continued to express concern about the disappearance of a man named Austin Tice in Syria. He was a freelance reporter who was last seen in 2012, and he is believed to be alive, and he is believed to be held captive, and the Syrian government is believed to know where he is, according to our sources. And we've been working really hard to try to get him out, to get him home to his family. We have spoken out about so many different cases. A Mexican journalist named Emilio Gutierrez Soto, who fled death threats in Mexico and tried to get asylum in the United States. That was 13 years ago. He's been caught in a maze of legal mumbo jumbo in the United States. We've been pushing for his case. We have been speaking out about the situation in Myanmar, where there are, I think, 40 journalists in jail right now, and 800 people, I think, have been killed at least in that situation. Closer to Algeria, we have spoken out about the repression of reporters in Turkey, something that really picked up steam after the coup attempt there a few years back. China and Russia, of course, are not exactly friendly places to report the news. The situation in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and Hungary, has gotten really bad for journalists. And ironically, those were, after the Berlin Wall fell down, that was a place where we really were hopeful that free enterprise and democracy and free press could flourish. And in recent years, we have seen them backsliding on that. Saudi Arabia is another case. The killing of Khashoggi, Jamal Khashoggi, the Washington Post columnist who was killed in the Saudi consulate in Turkey a few years ago. And U.S. authorities are convinced that Mohammed bin Salman was aware of and ordered him to be killed if necessary. We have been staying on top of that case too. So there are lots of cases like this, unfortunately, all over the world. And the situation for the press in general in the world is worse now than it was just a few short years ago. There have been the Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, did a study recently called the World Press Freedom Index, and they found that 73% of the countries in the world, the press is either blocked or constrained in some way. So not a free press, a free press in only 27% of the countries in the world. And another discouraging thing was a survey that was done that found that 59% of the people polled in 28 countries said in essence that they don't trust journalists, that they think journalists lie. So there's a problem of perception of people. Journalists have lost trust, and partly that's due to some extent that's due to our mistakes, but it's largely due to concerted campaigns by people like the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, who tried to get people not to believe what they see in real news organizations, and instead only believe what comes out of the mouths of the politicians. And so that has been a real campaign, and it has been working. And in the United States, we're seeing really bad effects of that. We're seeing large percentages of our population that believe, for example, that our presidential election in 2020 was rigged, was fraudulent. And that's not true, but still, a lot of people believe it. but the press is telling them what is true. And that was that we had a fair and legitimate election. So I wish I had some happier news about what's happening around the world, but it's a difficult time. It really is.
Thank you for all that.
It's more important for us to fight, you know?
Mm-hmm. You've said before, in relation to your last point, you said before that, or you've said in an acceptance speech for a journalism award that I watched, you said the biggest fake news story of all is the idea that truthful reporting is fake news, which I think you just touched on a little bit, but maybe if you want to expand on that anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the biggest problem in the United States right now, I would argue. I mean, we have a lot of problems, whether it's our, obviously the pandemic is a huge one, although it's getting better here. We have all kinds of problems, but we can't solve any of the problems if we are not able to distinguish fact from lies. And the fact that lies are being believed by so much of the population is hurting our ability to govern ourselves. And it is even hurting our ability to live peacefully next to each other. And we saw that on January 6th, when a mob attacked the beautiful capital of the United States, where you and I have spent so much time. And they attacked it because they thought that the government had, done something terrible. And they were convinced that the government had done something terrible, but it wasn't true. It wasn't true. They were brainwashed. And so, we can't have a society where large segments of the population are brainwashed. And that's why the press is absolutely critical. And, you and I are not here to talk about, obviously, we're not here to talk about how the United States is doing everything wonderfully and the rest of the world should just be like us, because we have some big problems. But our problems are because we are not sticking to our core values, because we're moving away from key principles like freedom of the press and belief in the value of the press. So it's not, so our original ideas were good ones. We just have to get back to them.
Mm-hmm. Well said. So I want to ask you some questions that are coming in on YouTube, and guys, please keep those questions coming. There's some pretty good questions so far. This is one question that relates to sources. So Abir F asks, how can you have a free press if you don't have transparent sources? What good does it do to the public if the sources who provide the information to media are inherently not reliable and are in control?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm really glad it was answered. Really glad it was asked, excuse me. First of all, in any newspaper that is a good newspaper, they will tell you exactly where they got their information. They will name the person or the organization where they got their information. Okay. Sometimes, however, the information will only be provided if the person is anonymous. If a government official is trying to tell you about something bad that is going on in the government, if they gave their name, they would lose their jobs. And so in those cases, for the public to know information that they wouldn't otherwise know, or they wouldn't know it until much later, it's important for us to be able to use that information and for the readers and the viewers to trust us that what we're telling them is true, even if the person's name is not attached to it. And it's in our interest to tell the truth, because what credibility would we have if we put out a bunch of stories that were not true? Now, some people would argue, well, you don't have any credibility, but that's not true. Most major news organizations that take their jobs seriously, their careers, their livelihood, the credibility of their organizations hangs on their presenting truthful information. So it's in their interest to prevent truthful information, because it's not going to be the last story they write. There's going to be another story tomorrow, another story day after that. And people have to believe what they read in order to come back and read the newspaper, right? So Yeah. So we disclose our sources as much as possible. We must use anonymous sources. Otherwise, people would not know critical information. In fact, the most critical information is usually comes from anonymous sources because it's something that is sensitive enough and a big enough deal that if the person were to tell you, they could get in a lot of trouble. So that's my answer to that.
Thanks for that. I think also a diversity of sources is a good point in this, because if somebody is if a journalist is only getting information from a government press release or a government official, and that's the only source of information, then try to find some other sources of information.
Absolutely, absolutely, and diversity in every sense. We news organizations are trying harder to make sure that we get out of our offices at least once the pandemic's over, and talk to more people from different walks of life, from different economic strata, different races and ethnicities, and all kinds of different backgrounds, so that it just will help us present a more accurate version of what's happening in the world if we can tap a variety of sources.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Next question is from Aniba Afaf, who asks, does a free press violate a right to a private life? And I assume this person is asking the right to the private life of the person who is being reported on, be it a government official, a celebrity, an everyday person. Do you think that a free press violates the right to a private life?
Well, a public official is just that, a public official. They have chosen to be a public official, and they have chosen to accept the scrutiny that comes with being a public official. And so that's just part of the deal. Now, that doesn't mean we have a right to report on anything and everything about the public official. We only have a right to report about the public, the things that are public in that public official's life, right? We don't have a right necessarily to report about private information, although you could make the case that if, for example, a politician were to spend his life and his career being harshly critical of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and then it turns out that this person was secretly a lesbian, gay, or bisexual, well, that would be private information, but it has a public implication. And so I think that would be a legitimate story. Probably too often the press does pry into private lives, more often than we should. A lot of that is because readers are curious about it. But I think especially when it comes to public officials, what they do and say that has a public implication is within the rightful scope of what reporters can look into, in my opinion.
Okay, I'd like to ask you a sensitive question that just came in. This is from Chev Chilios, who just asked, since you brought up fake news, can you tell us why the United States media can't cover the Israeli daily human rights abuses in Palestine without being labeled as anti-Semitic? And I would ask you, this kind of gets to, are there some issues in the United States? The implication from this question is, there are some issues in the United States that the press kind of can't touch, that the press maybe has to cover one way. Do you feel that that is the case, that there are taboo topics that a reporter just can't touch?
There may sometimes be subjects that there is sort of an unspoken taboo about. I don't know that the conflict in Gaza is one of those. I do think that you will find that if you open up the Washington Post, the New York Times, or you watch CNN, you will see coverage of the entirety of the, maybe not as much as you see on Al Jazeera, for example, but you will see coverage of it, and you will see coverage of the casualties on both sides, and you will see images of wounded Palestinian children, for example, in major American papers. So I don't think that the mainstream U.S. media is shying away from covering both sides of that. I do think there are times where sort of an unspoken code can prevent reporters from talking about or covering certain subjects. What springs to mind is during wartime, the press tends to get a little too patriotic and believe what the government says, even though wartime is exactly the time when governments are most likely to lie. For example, in the lead up to the Iraq War, I think the press was far too gullible about claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for example. And so, and I think there was a mood in the country that, we had just been attacked and we were kind of on a war footing. And unfortunately, the press is not immune to that kind of pressure. So I do think that there's a lot of truth to what the questioner is asking about. And there may even be a little bit of a bias here and there in favor of the Israelis in some media in the United States. But I think, and I'm talking here again about the mainstream publications like the Associated Press and the New York Times and CNN, I think they're covering this conflict thoroughly and showing both sides of it.
Thank you so much for that. Question from Fata Freelight, who's asking, so they're pointing out that CNN and Fox News and other big media organizations are owned by somebody. Do these big media organizations write something when the owner tells them to write it? So if the owner of a newspaper or a TV station has a certain point of view, say Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, who owns the Washington Post, has a certain point of view, does that mean that the news publication has to follow that point of view?
Generally, I would say no. I think there have been some instances of newspapers or TV stations reporting the news the way the owner wants them to report it, even if it's not true. We have, but I think generally, and particularly in the case of Jeff Bezos, I haven't seen any evidence of that kind of influence. And I would think that if it happened, that it would be divulged, that reporters in the news organization would be likely to, at least some of them would be likely to, perhaps anonymously, tell other reporters at other news organizations what was going on, and we would know about it. But there have been cases, and there are in the United States, we have a problem. Our local news in particular there are fewer and fewer sources of local news, and there are fewer and fewer companies that own the local radio, television stations, and newspapers. And there was a case a few years back where there was one owner of a lot of different stations, and on each of the stations, they were reading a commentary from the same script. And they were acting as if they were just the local news guy with his personal take on a situation, when in reality, they had been required to all read from the same script, which became obvious when people started talking to one another between cities. So there are definitely examples of it happening, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. But I do think that this idea that say a corporation that owns a news, or if a particular corporation owns a news organization, that news organization is likely to write only things that are favorable to that owner. I don't think that really happens that often. And if it does, because we have a free press, it gets exposed. So we even cover ourselves.
Exactly. That became a huge story when all these reporters were revealed to have just been forced to read a statement. Every journalist talked about that. Regular people, daily citizens talked about it. It was a big story.
And it was funny too.
It was very funny. It was embarrassing. A question from Solly Rover RSF. This person says the US is ranked at the 44th position in the 2021 World Press Freedom Index. Is this a matter of concern to you and your organization?
It absolutely is a matter of concern. And, we have spoken out wherever and whenever we can about some of the issues. And I've touched on some of them here. A lot of that has to do with the climate that was created by the previous presidential administration. But a lot of it has to do with kind of things that are happening in the states and in the cities, and in particular, what has been happening at the hands of our local police forces. Because a lot of the measures by which press freedom is gauged are reporters who are arrested or beaten or otherwise hurt. And unfortunately, we've seen a lot of that in the United States in the last year, because we have had protests in the street about racial discrimination by police forces and brutality by police forces. And ironically, those police forces have engaged in brutality during those protests against brutality. And reporters, a lot of people have been victimized, including reporters. And, for example, we gave, at the press club, we gave an award to a photographer named Linda Tirado, who, to recognize the fact that she had performed her job taking pictures of a protest, and she was shot in the eye by a policeman's rubber bullet in Minneapolis last year, and mostly blinded in that eye. And so these things happen in the United States. In fact, I think there were more than 130 arrests of reporters last year, or over the last year. I'm not sure if that's just 2020, or I believe it's just 2020. And 400 plus attacks on reporters. Now, some of these reporters were attacked by protesters, but a significant number of them were attacked by police, including after the reporter had obviously shown that they were there just covering the event, that they had press credentials. And so we have a big problem in the United States, and we at the National Press Club definitely recognize that.
Thank you for that. What can a reporter do, or a news organization do anywhere in the world, if a journalist is arrested while covering a protest, while covering a government event, while covering anything that they're allowed to be covering? What can a person do? Are there some organizations you recommend, international organizations such as yours, that they contact?
Yes. What a reporter should do will depend on where it happens. In the United States, we have an organization called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, rcfp.org. And they have information on their website about what reporters can do in the United States, and you can contact them. I would definitely draw the questioner's attention to and the whole audience's attention to an organization called Committee to Protect Journalists. Their website is cpj.org. And I would say that if you are having a problem in a country other than the United States, they would be a good organization to contact. Also, Reporters Sans Frontières, rsf.org, or Reporters Without Borders in English. They are another good organization to contact if you find yourself in trouble. And just in general, to keep up, if you're interested in these subjects, just check out those websites and you'll see stories, including stories about the situation in North Africa and the Middle East.
Thank you for that. I think that's about all the time we have, but I'd like to end with just one more question for you. You've outlined, what sounds like a very stressful and can be a very dangerous job, being a journalist. So why do this? Why do you continue to be a journalist? It sounds hard and scary.
Well, it's a lot harder and scarier for journalists in countries outside the United States, countries that, I don't mean all countries, but so many countries. It's a very dangerous place to be a journalist. And because we have the First Amendment here in the United States, going back to our first question, we have some protections, but it doesn't keep us from being shot in the eye by a policeman's rubber bullet every now and then. But we definitely have things better in the United States than elsewhere. But the real answer to your question, why journalism, why do this job, is because it is a kind of a moral calling. Because we believe in truth, we believe in facts, we believe that we are flawed, we don't get it perfectly right, we're not totally objective, but we believe that information and facts are out there to be found, and that the public is best served when they have the best information and the most information. And so that is our cause, and we believe it's true. And so it's kind of a calling. And so people are willing to put up with a lot to make that happen.
Thank you so much for that. John Donnelly, reporter with CQ Roll Call and the chair of the Free Press Committee for the National Press Club. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you everyone for tuning in on YouTube. Please follow our channel, hit the red subscribe button so you won't miss more talks like this. We usually do them Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Again, John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily.